Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament here, and I'm joined once again by Auron MacIntyre, 21st Reaction, and I have no idea how to pronounce your name. Lambuda, I think is the one I decided last time.
I'll take it. I like it that way.
Um, but yeah, so I'm joined by three people. And there was actually one thing I meant to ask before we got started, but I guess we'll have to ask it after getting started. Lambuda, are you a libertarian? I could have sworn you said that previously.
Yeah, I definitely would have said I was solidly libertarian a few years ago, and I may be becoming more moderate now. But yeah, that's where I come from politically overall.
Okay, good. Because I thought, with the topic of the stream today, that it would be interesting to have an at least sort of libertarian perspective on
Sure.
on this book.
It's okay. This is like the post-libertarian home.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that
We'll
what
get there eventually? Yeah.
Yeah, Moldbug talks about the same journey, doesn't he? Where he starts at Mises and then ends up at Carlyle. I can see myself slipping in the same direction, but I'm not there yet.
I mean, AA is doing that right now, right? It's just slowly turning into a reactionary from the 1800s, right? Like that's
The ultimate reactionary position is to work backwards through history and believe things earlier and earlier as you grow older.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so yeah, so that's one quick question I had. But yeah, so for those of you who are totally unaware, who I don't know clicked on the stream without reading the title, we're going to be discussing the book Chartism by Thomas Carlyle today. And for those of you who are unaware of who Thomas Carlyle was, he was an author from 1800s Scotland. He's pretty well known. I don't know. I mean, he's not like as well known as most people from that period. But he was a Counter-enlightenment author, and in particular, he wrote against stuff like the expanding of the franchise in the United Kingdom, and he criticized a lot of the social changes that were going on. In particular, with 19th century liberalism was the main thing that he was criticizing. And Chartism is, I'm pretty sure this is his most famous book. I've read a lot of his stuff. But I did a quick read through of this again to so it's fresh in my mind. But yeah, so Chartism, the concept of Chartism, for also those of you who are unaware, was a political movement from the 1800s in England that they had the 5-point charter that they were asking for, which was essentially the main sort of thrust of it was universal suffrage. I can't remember all 5 points off the top of my head, but it was all like things that we would consider very basic by today's standards. Secret ballot, universal suffrage, that type of stuff. The only thing that they never did end up getting was yearly elections. Other than that, the other 4 points of the charter are all things that we have today. And at the time were considered radical, but now, as we see, are sort of core parts of Western democracies. So that was the topic of the book. Carlyle was writing about how there was a lot of economic turmoil going on, how the peasantry was really poor and how they were upset, and how Chartism was the response to this, and how he thought this was the wrong response. But also he was unhappy with the other responses that were going on at the time. So with that sort of introduction, does anyone have anywhere they'd like to go with this?
So I haven't. I just started reading Carlyle this year, and I started in kind of a weird place. I started with like latter-day pamphlets, and one of the interesting things about Carlyle is, especially when you're reading the essays, is they're about the thing they're about, but they're also often not about the thing that they're about. You can be reading latter-day pamphlets and he's talking about prison reform, but what he's really talking about is, like, you're talking about, like, rejecting modernity, rejecting a lot of post-enlightenment ideas. There's definitely a thread through, and I haven't read deeply into his works yet, but from the couple ones I've read, especially when you're going through essay collections and that kind of thing, it will be about the topic, but it will also be about larger themes and ideas, which I think is why some people, when they start reading him, can find him kind of intimidating, or they can get disjointed, is he will be directly on top of the topic, and then he will go and talk about the broader ideas in kind of a way that's not directly related, but then he weaves them back in, which is why he ends up being kind of a genius at the end of it, because he's so good at doing that and bringing the wider perspective in and weaving it in with the details. But I found that again with Chartism, whereas where I'm going in and I'm reading about the movement in general and how it's dead, and how but it's not really dead because this thing is always with us, and how it then launches into kind of a larger discussion on what does it mean to be a valuable person, what does it mean to have a meaningful life, how do people make it through suffering, like all these things get woven into his discussion on kind of the timely political movement of Chartism, which I think is something that people will find consistently when they're looking at this kind of stuff from him.
It's almost like the Chartism is just a thread that he returns back to from time to time, and then bounces off and talks about other things that are on his mind. They'll circle around this one topic, right?
Yeah, he's always just a cantankerous, kind of angry old man that's just ripping on modernity, and then he just has like a pet topic that he's talking about, and then he goes on tangents, goes on a rant and everything. I kind of like the style, but I feel like I'm incapable to handle it, and sometimes I just have to skim. But yeah, I mean, Auron's right. There's some specific points that he goes through in latter-day pamphlets that doesn't seem to be about prison reform, and then Chartism has a few of those pet topics that he likes to touch on.
Not only is that the structure of his whole piece, his whole book, his whole essay, it's also the structure of some of his sentences. He'll start out saying something, interrupt himself, subclause, go 2 subclauses deep, and then pop back out, and you can't even remember why he was talking about this in the first place.
Yeah, I find when I'm reading Carlyle, it's usually like 21st Reaction said, oftentimes I'll go through the couple pages trying to get the gist of it, and then I'll go back and try to mine out the deeper stuff in there, because it does require making sure sometimes I need the context, and then I go back and say, okay, now what's the deeper thing he's trying to say inside of this. I find that to be a helpful habit when I'm going through Carlyle stuff.
Yeah, we think we're getting more smarter over the ages as we get access to more information and education. Then you read a Victorian novel and realize that your mind can't even follow it for 5 minutes, and it takes intense concentration. So yeah, we're actually degenerating.
Well, and as far as I understand, Carlyle was someone who was very, deeply respected in his time and much more widely read. He's kind of fallen out of favor due to many of his stances and positions. He ended up on the wrong side of history on a number of things post-Enlightenment. And so while you won't see as much of him in your high school literature class, I think he's of as high a caliber as anybody of his age. I think he's absolutely up there with the greats of his age for sure.
Yeah, my first introduction to Carlyle was actually from a lefty Marxist university professor. Gave me him to read once in class. So it was interesting, and I was completely unprepared for it. I barely understood what I was reading. It was just like readings I did the day before. But yeah, he also especially has we'll probably get to reading some quotes from this book at some point during this stream, so you'll get to see this. But he has a sort of unique writing style, and I mean that also can make this somewhat difficult for people to get into. But yeah, as you guys were saying, Chartism is sort of the theme that he uses to weld this this book together. He sort of sees it as representative of the social movements that had been going on throughout Europe over the past century or centuries or however long. There's many points throughout the book where he says stuff like Chartisms, radicalisms, French revolutions, with sort of the understanding being that these things are all more or less equivalent.
And wasn't it Carlyle who basically originated the concepts of left and right in politics? That's an idea that we're very familiar with now, but at Carlyle's day, that the equation of these things was quite new. He was pioneering in that.
Well, and what's very interesting is, while a lot of people think of Carlyle as reactionary, of course, many criticisms aimed at him is that he's a socialist, right? You'll hear this a lot of like Sedler was saying, a number of left wingers who will still read on Carlyle will read him as a socialist, because he's certainly talking about communitarianism and duty to to the different classes. This is the main, we'll of course I guess get deeper into Chartism here, but it's one of the main thrusts of the book is you basically the condition of England question. You have basically two nations forming. You have two very separate experiences inside England forming after industrialization, and that's a heavy amount of what he's talking about. Is now that we have this new social dynamic, where we have the industrialization and we have wage labor, what does it do to the class of people who are running it? What does it do to the class of people who are now earning it? Does it dehumanize them? Does it can we really look at the material conditions of the people and say that determines their spiritual condition and well-being? These are all questions that he's tackling inside of that. So while people today might look at him as perhaps very right-wing on social issues, economists would not find him that at all. Today's libertarian would find him as terrifying as any social justice warrior. And so he both defines some of those things, but also defies them, because this isn't a doctrine that's welded, that's etched in stone for him. He's writing when these things are really forming.
Yeah, I suppose sort of briefly it would be useful to sort of right now just go over that the on these topics that Aaron is talking about are pretty much what the first two chapters are about. The first one's called The Condition of England question, and the second is called Statistics. And the Condition of England question is, as Aaron said, it's like the question of how do you determine like how the country is really going. And basically in these first two chapters, the point he's trying to make is that stats aren't really useful at determining whether or not things are okay or not. He has this one passage in the second chapter where he says every now and again you'll get this prophet who's an economic Jeremiah lamenting the condition of the peasants and how awful everything is, and then someone will come up to him and tell him, well, actually no, this statistic says everything's all right, and he'll, wow, I guess that means everything is fine then. And this is something that we see quite a bit today. I mean, back when I was a libertarian, this is something I used to use. That like you can buy like 5 times as many TVs today as you could 20 years ago, or whatever. I'm sure we're all quite I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. I'm sure we're all quite familiar with those types of arguments. So that's basically the point. And in particular, the point that he makes in the second chapter, Statistics, is that statistics just aren't very useful at measuring these things. I have some quotes here on this. A witty statesman said, "You might prove anything by figures. We have looked into various statistic works, statistics, society reports, poor law reports, reports and pamphlets, not a few, with sedulous I don't know, not going to pronounce that word right, I to the question of the working class and their general condition in England. And we grieve to say that that with as good of a result as with as good as no result whatever. So again, that's just basically his point there, that that the statistics aren't very useful at coming to any sort of conclusion on this. And I think where this is especially relevant is sort of, as Aaron was saying, the bending between left and right. Is that from a lot of modern conservatives and libertarians, but even just sort of mainstream conservatives, there's sort of this perception that conservatives are supposed to be like the big brain, like, oh yeah, I read like economics, and like economics proves X or Y or whatever. And like, economics is fine, like even statistics are fine, like all that stuff's cool and stuff, but it's also kind of cringe. And because it doesn't really get at the spirit of what's going on. It doesn't really get at a lot of the greater questions of society. It's something Edmund Burke made a similar point in Reflections on the Revolution in France. He said the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophists, economics, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. It's a pretty famous quote from him. And again, it's where today, like, conservatives have traded their entire intellectual history for, I don't know, 5% tax cuts. It seems like statistics and economics and calculating all this type of stuff is quite important, and this is actually what conservatism is about. And I get called a communist for questioning any of this stuff, but it's actually all quite cringe, I guess, to wrap up my point there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've come around on a lot. I had a very, boomer GOP outlook. I came up in the talk radio Republican crowd and all that kind of thing, and definitely had much of that outlook. And that was always a compelling argument for me. Numbers go up. As long as the numbers go up, everybody's fine. As long as everything fits into a spreadsheet that shows at the end of the day that things are better, then who are we to argue about the day-to-day lives of people? And that's really why what Carlyle is saying in this essay speaks so much to me, because that's something that I've just learned so much in the last year or two, is just that there has to be more. We have to understand more. Some things are not worth the economic sacrifice. Some things are not definable simply by putting them down on a spreadsheet. And so when Carlyle's talking about how that is a terrible measure for the actual well-being of people and the quality of life of people, I think that's huge. And the fact that we feel the need to reduce everything to that really, by necessity, makes us ignore the most important parts of life, such as spirituality. Things that are not easily quantifiable simply become useless because the quantification on in statistics is the only thing that we can look at wide scale. It also, I think, encourages us to do things like globalize, because if you can't rule a province from half a world away if you have to actually care about the day-to-day lives of people. But if you can reduce the day-to-day lives of people to numbers, and the numbers can be made to go up, then you can justify the rule of people far away. And I think that is a large part of what justifies and drives the globalization we see today, is that we are able to do that because everyone is so trained to think if we can just produce the right numbers, then everything is fine and everything is working.
Interesting to see how the boomer cons and the GOP, it's like their mind is controlled by a futuristic techno-capital AI. And Nick Land enters the chat, and it kind of falls apart. But I'm honestly glad I was always saved from that that kind of school of thought, that Milton Friedman, freedom qua freedom. If the GDP grows, then it's good. But yeah, even in that age, it's kind of like Carlyle had such serious foresight with this issue, because it seems to be the reigning ideology even now of endless economic growth. And this is 200 years ago, so he gets that right then. And of course, we like to look at all these people through a modern frame of, oh, left versus right, or socialism versus capitalism, or these kind of paradigms that just don't hold up in the past. When, of course, Carlyle, although he had a good feelings for the working class and poor at the time, describing it as socialism would be kind of inappropriate. I mean, like, the radical reformers and trade unionists that he was worried about in the Chartist movement were probably more analogous to socialists than him. So I do agree with Carlyle. It's just noblesse oblige, and that's way better.
You mentioned that the Enlightenment had sort of cancelled Carlyle. I think he is quite an anti-Enlightenment figure. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who referred to him as being a figure of anti-rationality, and some of that is what we've been talking about. This, and I'd like to do another couple of sentences, having ragged on him for his long sentences. Some of the way he writes is absolutely incredible and really sarcastic and fantastic. So here's a couple of sentences on this topic. Statistics, one may hope, will improve gradually and become good for something. Meanwhile, it is to be feared. And he also says, a judicious man says he looks at statistics not to get knowledge, but to save himself from having ignorance foisted on him. So it's a flip. We don't start with statistics as a way of exploring the world. We first understand how the world works. And then when someone says something crazy, you can go and check the statistics and figure out why they're wrong. But yes, nowadays, post-Enlightenment, we think the only way to truth is through the kind of the scientific method, completely ignoring all of the other ways to truth. And same thing in economics. We think the only key to human flourishing or improvement in life is your money going up. But actually, according to Carlyle, the wages you receive and the bread that you buy with it is just one quite small factor in the whole of the quality of your life.
Yeah, I think one thing that this is quite analogous to is the sort of lines we hear from like lefties today a lot, is stuff like follow the science, like just do what the science says. As if science is like, I don't know, you pour some beakers into each other and then it says universal healthcare. It's and again, like, I don't know, like I actually like statistics quite a bit. I use them a fair bit, but statistics, what people sort of forget is statistics don't really tell you anything on their own. Science doesn't really tell you anything on their own. History doesn't even tell you anything on its own. All any of these things are useful for is to be weaved into some sort of narrative. And you can have this is something you see in sort of the arts a lot, where you'll get someone that has like liberal arts. You'll get someone that has like a big bibliography. They have all the citations. They'll like, I'm so big brained and smart. How can I have all these citations and be wrong? And what they don't really understand is like anyone can come up with like 500 citations about sexism in Victorian tea advertisements if they want. Like the citations aren't really what matters. What matters is like it's a necessary component. You need to be able to cite something, but all that really matters at the end of the day is your ability to weave those citations into some sort of coherent argument.
How dare you question the magisterium of science?
Well, and this is an ongoing theme through Carlyle's work. If you read latter-day pamphlets, he goes on this quite a bit. He really goes after what science has done to mankind's ability to think. He's not anti-science. He's not against the process of science, but
science is a little cringe.
Yeah, of course, obviously, like we all agree with that. But he very much points out that the public consumption of science makes people lazy and unable to think about things because they can just hand it over to a particular set of numbers. He often talks about how small it makes humanity and how it makes people sad and small, and it reduces the wonder of the universe. Because people think that just having a couple of numbers scribbled down on a piece of paper has unlocked, the sacred and the divine and the mysterious. and that this is going to have a lot of consequences down the road. And we can see this now as people, who are, who worship science don't know a man from a woman and can't tell the difference, and can't, or at least can't admit, what their eyes and everything about them knows. And so we just see that this really deteriorates, people's ability to just think about topics, because I mean, if it's not reducible to statistics, then it's simply not worth your time. It's simply, it's not objective. Then it's all just a matter of opinion, and you can't have any definitive answer. So therefore, it's just not worth doing. And you can see this impact on all kinds of aspects of our society. I'm someone who's worked in education before, and they're very big on data-driven strategies, because everything needs to be, again, you need to be able to show on a spreadsheet that you're doing things that work. And so it doesn't really matter if the students are learning, it matters that your numbers go up. And so you see a large number of educators fudging, what they do in the classroom, making sure that their students are learning ways to get the numbers up, and leaving critical thinking skills, leaving the ability to understand, memorize things, the ability to, to suss out meaning. All these things are left by the wayside, because at the end of the day, what really matters is getting those numbers up. And that's just there's a million different ways to look at that in the real world, but that's just one of the ways that this is not reflecting how humans actually grow and their well-being.
There's a fantastic concrete example that he gives of this. He says, a few years ago, in regions where thrift to one's knowledge still was, savings banks were not. The labourer lent his money to some farmer or capital, or supposed to be of capital, and has too often lost it since, or he bought a cow with it, brought a cottage with it, nay, hid it under his thatch. The savings bank's books then exhibited mere blank and zero, and they swell yearly now. If such be the fact, indicates that what thrift exists does gradually resort more to thither than elsewhither. What he's saying is, if you're trying to figure out how much saving is happening, this is a specific example, you can't just look at the banks and ask them how much savings is there currently in your banks, because you're completely ignoring that prior to the existence of the banks, people did save up resources, but they saved it in different ways. But when you're myopically focused on a number, such as what's the total that the banks currently have in household savings, you can make that number go up. It doesn't necessarily represent any change in the real world.
Maybe he should read the quotes because he's British. But yeah, I mean, Auron's comments about the public schools and the education system make me want to just leave society. It's so sad, honestly. But yeah, the data-driven stuff is kind of nonsensical. So it's like these moral ends and greater purposes are the justification, and then statistics are the instrument that kind of flows from that. But now we're so insane that we go from statistics backwards. We invert it. It's statistics to a moral purpose or end. And then if you look at the even greater timeline, it's empiricism in science, which was derived from theology and an understanding of God as an intelligible and ordering agent in the world, for the entire world. And that's the foundation. And now we invert it to the point of science. Knowing things empirically can lead us to whatever God we want, whether it's the God of money or God of progress or Moloch or whatever. But yeah, I mean, Carlyle is just, the reason why Carlyle is so popular with some of these thinkers is that he notices some of these points early on, because we're still in the middle of those kinds of intellectual memes in history, and he's able to catch them when they're like only 50 years old. So that's commendable. But do you want to start with a little overview of the Chartist movement itself? Because we're referring to some of the ideas in the book, but it might be nice to get to the supposed issue that he's talking about.
I mean, I think I already explained it pretty well. I mean, I guess the economic problems was mainly about industrialization and urbanization during that century. That of course this was something that had taken place throughout the entire Industrial Revolution, of course, but it was really coming to a head during the 1800s. That people were moving away from the traditional agricultural communities towards cities, and they were moving away from subsistence stuff like subsistence farming to wage labor. And one of the things in particular that that Carlyle talks about in this book is sort of the breakdowns of bonds of loyalty. How in former societies, your like feudal lord or whoever was expected to have some sort of duty to the peasants, and vice versa. The peasants had a duty to their masters. But in the new sort of wage-based economy, this isn't really the case. People's only loyalty is to like the contracts they make and to the wages that they make. Yeah. So I mean that's just the sort of basic overview of the economics of the time.
So one part that I really liked is chapter 5, and at the beginning of chapter 5, he talks about what really makes something interminable, like what really robs someone of meaning, and what makes classes feel used and like they have a low quality of life. And his argument here is that it's injustice and it's disorder. And he says it is not what a man outwardly has or wants that constitutes the happiness of misery of him. Nakedness, hunger, distress of all kinds, death itself has been cheerfully suffered when the heart was right. It is the feeling of injustice that is insupportable to all men. And he talks about how men can't bear being misused. And he says, no man can bear it or ought to bear it. A deeper law than any parchment law whatsoever, a law written directly by the hand of God in the inmost being of man, incessantly protests against it. What is injustice? It's another name for disorder, for, now I'm going to get words wrong, unveracity, unreality, a thing which voracious create, sorry, don't know all the words he's using here, created nature, even because it is not chaos and a waste whirling baseless phantasm, rejects and disowns. And he really just goes into how you can really bear anything if there's order and justice and you feel that God has placed it before you. If you can feel kind of the order that God has put into the world, and that you are a part of it, and you are suffering on behalf of it and working towards this order and justice, that's what's going to give you the ability to move forward and feel like you're part of a community, and as you were saying, part of a society. And so I just thought he had a really interesting point in there, that really he doesn't think it's going to be the franchise or numbers going up. It's not you having a voice in these things necessarily that's going to make you feel that you have meaning and purpose and duty. It's going to be that these things are worth something and that they're building towards something and they're part of a greater order. That's what's really going to allow you to suffer through anything, no matter what it is.
So what he goes on from there to talk about is that because injustice is the real measure of whether humans are being given a decent condition in life or not, and injustice is subjective, if individuals within your society feel they're being treated unjustly, that is a problem by definition. Now, so far, the tenor of the conversation is Carlyle is great of what we've talked about so far. So I'd like to come in with a counter opinion on this specific point that you feel free to argue back. But I sense the roots of progressivism in some of what Carlyle says. He's saying that the feeling that you've been oppressed must mean that you are oppressed and that you have some right to recompense. He's saying that just because there are people in society who have, if I'm reading him correctly, he's saying that if people are complaining, if people are taking to the streets and protesting, the very fact that they're doing that proves that they have some genuine complaint, which I think is a common perspective. People see someone complaining and think, well, they must have some reason for complaint. So what do you think about my accusation against Carlyle here?
Whatever bad opinions he has, I'll just blame that on the fact that he was a Calvinist. Oh, but seriously, I think it's actually in this situation, it might look like that's what he's saying, but I think he was just identifying the pains of the working class, but it wasn't. But the reason is it was actually genuine, and it was because he had sympathies for their kind of removal from their more traditional communities and for the actual things happening there, because he spends a lot of time describing how they've actually lost those bonds of loyalty, lost those things that are necessary for human life. So it wasn't necessarily just because they were complaining, although he was really concerned about that, because apparently they were quite a squeaky wheel at the time. There was lots of Irish and northern working class people rioting and causing severe troubles and higher crime rates at the time, disproportionate to the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he would be 100% where you're putting him either, because he's very repeatedly throughout his work very against uprisings, up against social disorder. I don't think in any way he would say, well, if anyone's out there in the streets causing disorder, then they must have a good reason. I don't think that's anything near what he's saying. I think what he's saying is that that we need to deal with this. And he says this a number of times. He says, look, this issue is real, and it's going to keep manifesting itself until something's done. And if we don't get this answer right, then the wrong answer comes forward. And he thinks the wrong answer is the expansion of franchise, is the expansion of these things. I don't think he's saying that everything they would do is justified no matter what, but he's saying, look, this issue is going to continue, and there must be something here, because if there isn't, then we're just going to be perpetually dealing with this forever. We need to get the right answer in place before something worse happens.
Yeah, I guess I came to it expecting strong reactionary position, and actually found more of a centrist kind of take, which is the particular approach that's being advocated at the moment won't work, but we ought to do something to address these problems.
Yeah, he's not even that extreme during the time, but he might appear a little extreme just because clearly Britain was far left at that time with how much democracy was ascendant, but he himself was, like Auron was saying, was quite against enfranchisement, and really one of his central points throughout all of his work is being anti-democracy, and literally, like, democracy is the system of that will cause all evil and suffering basically the next century, which definitely happened. But yeah, I mean, Carlyle was indeed the real centrist, and I wish he was center right, but he was just a centrist. But I think when it gets down to the root of the book, Chartism is just the working class racketing for enfranchisement into the House of Commons. He has a really good quote about attacking that sentiment, and it's here in the Laissez-faire chapter. So, democracy, we are well aware, what is called self-government of the multitude by the multitude, is in words the thing everywhere passionately clamored for at present. Democracy makes rapid progress in these latter times, and ever more rapid, in a perilous accelerative ratio towards democracy, and that only the progress of things is everywhere tending to the final goal and winning post. So think, so clamor the multitudes everywhere. And yet all men may see, whose sight is good for much, that in democracy can lie no finality, that with the completest winning of democracy there is nothing yet won, except emptiness, and the free chance to win. And so, just like the problem with statistics, the problem with empiricism, all that other stuff we were coming, democracy is kind of a spook in terms of producing any kind of moral end or purpose to it. It's just a instrument.
Yeah, and in the same chapter, it's interesting because I had one of those marked too. He also talks about, he says, democracy was never really good for anything except, canceling itself out. And he talks about the different disasters of it. And he says, really, democracy only gets something done when a dictator shackles democracy under his feet. Basically, unless a strongman comes by and takes democracy and uses it to drive the people towards his ends, democracy really just ends up being a disaster. Is kind of his push there, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, on what you were saying, Lambuda, how do I pronounce your name?
Lambda. Just ignore the
Lambda.
B. Yeah, get rid of the B. Like a lamb and then duh.
Okay, that's easier. So Lambuda. Yeah. So, but what you were saying before, I mean, I definitely agree. Like, I think Carlyle's a great writer. I think he has a lot of very interesting stuff to say. But I do definitely think there's both a left wing and a right wing reading of him. And there's many like just because he's like, I don't know, like. I just dealing with like YouTube comment sections and Twitters and stuff like this for so long. I understand that people have a real hard time with nuance. I can say I like Carlyle, and that doesn't mean that I think everything Carlyle said was right. Like I don't know why it's complicated, but I know it's going to be complicated for some people. But yeah. So no. But the point I was trying to make is I definitely think there's sort of problematic things embedded in parts of his philosophy. I would say, though, on the particular point you were making, I think more or less where he's coming from that is if you have a societal problem and if you fail to deal with it, that's kind of your fault. For example, if there is a social movement, if there is like BLM or whatever, and they're upset, it doesn't mean that their grievances are correct, but it does mean it's a real problem. It doesn't, and that their feelings need to be dealt with one way or another. You can't just ignore large social movements. In particular, we sort of see this view from him is the French Revolution, where his take was he sort of had the attitude that the monarchy kind of deserved it for sucking, where a lot of right wing reactions to it were that like the French Revolution was awful and terrible and evil and everything, and like he wasn't like pro French Revolution, but he was more sort of he was less pro the anti-revolutionary side also, and also. I'd say just another sort of problematic thing that is in sort of Carlyle's thought is there's sort of a subjectivism in a lot of him, and I think a lot of this probably comes from that he wasn't a Christian. He of course came from a Calvinist background, but he apostatized, and I think he was a deist. He definitely wasn't atheist. He definitely wasn't an atheist, but he wasn't a Christian either. So this sort of put him in a position where, like in hero worship, one of the heroes he talks about is Muhammad. And I mean that's fine. Like I'm not saying there's anything wrong with talking about Muhammad as an archetype. But the sort of point that I'm trying to make is that in a lot of his stuff, he has this sort of subjectivist viewpoint.
Interesting. Are you sure he wasn't a Christian? Because reading through Latter-day pamphlets, like he goes pretty deep into a number of theological points. I mean, maybe he was just familiar enough with them, but he seems pretty supportive of them.
I'm pretty confident that he became a deist.
Fair enough.
Like that.
He was training. He was studying Calvinism at one point, and then he decided, for various complicated reasons, to give up Christianity, but remained very religious, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, he certainly writes as if he has a very particular, position on theology. So that's just interesting.
Now, another just to stir up trouble again, another interesting take that he had in this in Chartism was that the solution to the problem of mass immigration that they were experiencing from Ireland was that everyone should just go around the world. This new global community that had formed itself well, it says on a certain western rim of our small Europe, there are more men than were expected, heaped up against the western shore, and for a couple of 100 miles inland, the tide of population swells too high and confuses itself somewhat. Overpopulation, and yet is this small western rim of Europe overpeopled? Does not everywhere else a whole vacant earth, as it were, call to us? So he's saying, well, just give up, merry old Blighty, and move elsewhere in the world. This is a surprising take again, I would say.
Yeah, I remember him specifically, running through, the Malthusian dilemma. I think, talking about for a couple pages about, what a problem that was going to be and how the need to expand. And yeah, I mean, I really don't know. Obviously, that's the imperialism, I guess, is what is that going to be construed as imperialism, saying that you need to go, to all these different places, or just immigration? I don't know how that would be taken today.
I don't know if he's even talking about going to other parts of the British Empire. He's talking about every continent of the world. Just go out. The world is your oyster now that we're becoming a single united globe.
I don't know. I mean, I had the feeling that he was talking more about the empire. I mean, I believe he specifically references Canada
Maybe.
in that passage, which of course is a part of the empire at this point. But sorry, just reading something. But yeah. So I don't know. I kind of had that impression that that he was talking about like filling up the empire, and I mean, I also kind of had the impression from that section that that he wasn't even necessarily conceding to the overpopulation theory. He was just saying, like, you complain about this, you say this is a big issue. If this is an issue, like, we have a whole globe that we can move to. It's but I didn't. I don't know. I could be wrong, but I didn't really get the feeling that he was actually conceding to the overpopulation theory. Just that he was saying, like, if I accept your premises, it's still like cringe.
Yeah, there's still an easy solution to that problem. Yeah.
It's literally the it's literally like the conservative line for climate change today. It's like, if I take all your premises, well, actually, there will be an increase in crop production as it gets warmer. But yeah, it's good.
So where else should we go with this?
I thought it was interesting, Carlyle's take on someone mentioned earlier the two groups in society almost, that there's one group that are the workmen using their hands, and the other group that are guiding with their minds. And he actually seems to suggest that it is for both people's benefit that this continues. In fact, he says, surely of all the rights of man, this right of the ignorant man to be guided by the wiser, to be gently or forcibly held in the true course by him, is the indisputablest. Nature herself ordains it from the first. I thought that was a really interesting way to conceive of the world, that we like to think of everybody being of the same role in the world. That's not how people saw it in history.
The same role, yuck. But
well, it goes against the idea of specialization, which of course is the bedrock of a modern growing economy, right? If everybody is required to be completely self-sufficient, a farmer, and they deliver their own post and everything, we'd all be poor. We have to specialize, but yet the concept that we would rely on one another is somehow kind of disgusting to the modern mind.
Right. Yeah, I would take that point seriously. And Carlyle saying, as obviously he's acknowledging the reality of the human pyramid, where basically there's this very small group of people that think intensely about higher ideals and like guiding everyone below that, and then there's kind of professional managerial people, and then there's this large section of working people that are kind of simple and just work with their hands. And it's interesting because he not only, nowadays the farthest you could go is just tacitly acknowledging and just accepting that as that's just the way things are. But Carlyle is goes a step farther and saying it's a great duty and obligation that literally builds up civilization over time when they fulfill those kind of patron-client relationships that people have. And yeah, I mean, I would agree. It's just strange nowadays how, like you said, we can have all this specialization and globalization, but there's not supposed to be any community that unites it, no bonds of loyalty. It's very strange.
I can really tell in the chat people who never interacted with fraternities in college because none of them know what a lambda is. Yeah, Carlyle famously defended slavery, right? Like that's the thing that puts him probably in the no camp for most modern literature courses. Is he really ended up on the wrong side of that debate right before his opposition won that rather resoundingly, both in the military and in the public space. And so when he wrote in justification of these relationships, like you say, he doesn't just do it in the master-slave relationship. He also does this in the upper class, lower class distinction. He sees this as a theme that runs throughout humanity, that there are those that are going to guide and those that are going to lead, and that this is the natural order of things, and that it's a duty and something that's core to kind of your meaning and purpose in life is to fulfill those roles. So he doesn't shy away from that distinction in any way, be it more controversially or less controversially. You'll see that throughout his work as well, that he certainly believes that there are those who are meant to guide and those who are meant to be guided. And I think that's a point that he makes throughout.
Yeah, in the Laissez-faire chapter, of course, the issue here is that the kind of the reigning ideology, this Adam Smith, is intellectually ascendant at this time, and so I can imagine the Tories and the Whigs were repeating the mantra of laissez-faire, which just means leave alone and allow it to proceed as it would, just based on the markets. Of course, he points out that what they're actually doing is the elite is simply abrogating their role as the guider and the leader and the caretaker of the working class and the people below them. And so we see this problem where it's supposed to be this patron-client relationship that has existed for millennia and forever, but it starts to break down because this elite, the parliament, the church, the intellectuals, they're repeating leave alone, and they're relying on statistical data, and they're relying on these kinds of ideas without really any of the wisdom backing it up. So it's kind of like an elite class that has been degenerated and is bereft of the wisdom that might be used to guide the people in that time. And of course, since they leave alone and they just sit at their data books and they make these kind of measly, lukewarm policies in response, the problem just gets worse and worse, and there's riots and there's extreme unpopular and civil unrest during the 1830s.
Yeah, and you can see, we talked about how he said the wrong solution is expanding suffrage. And what he says is the right solution is a real aristocracy, an aristocracy that's actually worth something. Because what Carlyle and many people of the time point out repeatedly, this is definitely something Carlyle kind of harps on throughout his work, is that the nature of industrialization and wage labor has basically freed the aristocracy from duty to those it controls. Because once they've been paid their wage, well, they've been compensated for their work. Now it's up to them. By leaving themselves to figure these things out, they're going to build moral character and become better citizens and more independent citizens. And Carlyle's far from the only anti-enlightenment reactionary to say, no, this is not the case. This is not what's going to happen. These people, you've basically turned the peasants off their land, said, here's your wages for working the land. Now go figure things out for yourselves. And it's a social disaster. as we develop these classes that we're not in the habit of handling all of these things for themselves, and we've now given the aristocracy basically an out to let them just say, oh well, I don't have to care about you anymore, I paid your wage, right, we're done. And that's something he definitely brings up, not just here but throughout his writings.
You mean there's an answer to the right of pull yourself up by the bootstraps? It's kind of interesting how that rugged individualism that they're starting to appeal to is still a very primary ideology today. And pull yourself up by. It's interesting to see that the answer that's to the right of rugged individualism and pull yourself up by the bootstraps and personal responsibility is like, oh, there needs to be an elite that tenderly and compassionately takes care of their brethren.
Yeah,
speaking of taking care of your brethren, man cannot live by bread alone, but I still need money. So donate subscribestar.com/settlers lament. It's mandatory. This is not optional. I see a lot of in the live chat, I see a lot of people saying they're computer programmers. Cool, give me money. Sounds like you got money if you're a programmer. But yes, back to your regularly scheduled programming. I also have a Patreon too, and I even sell t-shirts, all in the description. But yes, back to this. I suppose one thing I sort of wanted to bring up on this question is this, like, this complaining about how, like, bonds of loyalty being broken down, of the way that economics, that power relations have changed over the centuries. This is all stuff that we've probably heard from various sources many times, and it sounds not so dissimilar from people talking about how the modern gig economy is different from just the economy it was a few decades ago, and even from prior to the gig economy. How more modern corporations are. How there's like less of loyalty, how it's less likely that you'll spend your entire life working for one corporation, how you'll have to get lots of jobs from lots of different corporations probably throughout your life. But I don't know, I guess just sort of to give the libertarian or the classical liberal or whatever side of the argument, if like this has been going on for so long, if this has been going on for over 200 years now, which I mean, Carlyle isn't quite over 200 years. This book from him isn't quite over 200 years old. But these arguments go back from before him even. Is this really so accurate, or is this just like boomers complaining about the good old days? Not everyone all at once.
Are we saying that Carlyle was wishing to hark back to a previous era when the relation between people was more relational, or is he wanting to create a new utopia that was only now possible in the modernity of whatever it was, 1840? I don't know if he is he's a boomer of the time looking backwards so much as a visionary. If he could be criticized for something, it is trying to create a new world that hadn't existed before. And I think he was very influential. This idea that captains of industry, I think he coined this term, would become not only the person who pays your wage, but would set up a community. That happened, and to this day, it's still what people are taught as they become successful in business. That you don't just make a small business with 30 people in and do good for the world. Try to set up a little mini civilization. Your employees are your best friends. So I think he's had a big impact on the way people think in this regard. And as a libertarian, I'm not sure I think it was a good impact, but.
Well, I think I think that what he is often saying there is that basically those who are now the captains of industry simply don't have social obligations or the noblesse oblige of a more traditional aristocracy. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that most people, the businesses today are trying to create the community and that kind of thing. But I think they're doing it for the opposite reason, the one he would talk about against in Chartism. Chartism, most of the multinational corporations that are, building a banana republic, in your locality are doing so to make the numbers go up, right? Like the whole reason, I don't know if you guys have been in any corporate culture, but I'm sure we've all had mandatory fun at some point, where we're all going to this thing. All of us are going. All of us, and
Yeah.
and so that's supposed to be there in theory to build, team structure and, raise people's spirits and this kind of thing, which is why every Fortune 500 company is willing to put, a cafeteria with organic food and some ping pong tables on campus in hopes that raises productivity. But it's only about the productivity, right? It's never about the condition of England. It's never actually about the condition of the society and the people living in it. It's never a part of their well-being. The well-being is only something that is to be understood as something that increases the productivity and functioning of the company. And so I think you're right that many companies do look at social benefits now and say, oh, look, I have done this and it makes people more profitable when they're happy. So this is now the best standards and practices that everyone should adopt. But I think they're doing it for exactly the opposite reason Carlyle would have wanted them to.
I don't know. I reckon a lot of corporate culture is sadly genuine. I think people really think that their impact on the world by organizing some, paintballing event for the middle managers is for the benefit of mankind. You might be right. Maybe up at the C-suite, there's a lot of cynicism and it's all hard line. But if you think about the psychology of the tech leaders in Silicon Valley, for example, do they genuinely care about the bottom line of their company, or do they think that they're involved in a project which is changing the world for what they consider to be the better? Kind of an open question, but I think they genuinely are of the opinion that they're important in world history and are captains of industry in the Carlylean sense.
No, I would agree with that, and I think these people, Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, you really get the idea of them. It's kind of like a fat cat, a successful person that becomes prominent, and then kind of adopts a religion later in life, and that's what they're doing. And they're just adopting the ideology of the cathedral, and they just want to make a difference, But I think Lambda's right. In most cases, these things are genuine, but it is saccharine. So that's the one problem with it. And that's why I escaped and just am streaming this from a cave in the middle of nowhere.
It's the right move. Absolutely. Hermitage, go. But no, you guys are way more optimistic about the about the motivations of Silicon Valley tech moguls than I am, I guess. Like, I think you're right that they talk themselves into the idea that they're changing people's lives. Like, I'm sure that
we're just helping people and making a difference and reducing harm in the public space.
Like, I'm sure that's true, but I think it also probably doesn't escape their notice that that also always happens to coincide with vastly increasing their power and wealth. And upping their bottom line. I mean, yes, like I think they probably have some of that mixed in, but again, I think even if that is their motivation, the way that they measure that motivation again is statistical, right? It is on a spreadsheet. It's all the things that Carlyle questioned in Chartism as measures of human well-being. So even if they are more purely motivated than my cynical take says, I think that still their methods are ones that Carlyle would find repugnant.
They're quite a mystery in are they just purely disingenuous and cynical, or are they purely ideological and just have rose-colored glasses covering them? And of course, it's just a way in which these things balance. It seems that instead of them being genuine and just going towards convenience, perhaps they have an instinct to be attracted to higher numbers, to wealth, to more status and power. And these ideas are kind of really poetic and aesthetically pleasing ways to get there.
Well, I don't think there's anything unique either in that these things work together for them. Did Caesar fight for the good of the empire, or did Caesar fight for his own power? Yes, right? Like, if you can't, and I think, I have not yet read Heroes and Hero Worship, but I am somewhat familiar with the great man of history narrative, and I don't think any great man of history doesn't think that way, right? Like, and I think you'll see this over and over again. Again, you can read, Joseph de Maistre, you can read a lot of different people on sovereignty and power and these kind of things, and they'll often say a similar thing. If you don't have that understanding of that you have the right to rule and you have the authority and you're willing to exercise the authority, and you have you have the greater good of some kind in mind, then you won't. The only people who come to power are people who have these prerogatives, right, and have this assuredness in both their rightness and that their rightness should accrue power to them. And so I don't think Silicon Valley moguls are any different than many people who have this motivation throughout history. I think that's a pretty common occurrence.
Okay, well, I'm glad I can check that requirement off of my list. But I did want to get back to one of the elements of it. Of course, these people worship money, and we still worship money. Progressives talk about how amassing moneyed wealth is kind of bad and you should feel uncomfortable for doing it, but they also still worship money and they just envy people that have a bunch of money. And then the boomer cons are like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and increase your number on a screen about how many dollars you have. So that's yet another idea that was ascendant even back to this time period, and he acknowledges it. I have a quote from a chapter called Not Laissez-faire, and it says this: cash payment, the sole nexus. And there are so many things which cash will not pay. Cash is a great miracle, yet it has not all power in heaven, nor even on earth. Supply and demand we will honor also, and yet how many demands are there, entirely indispensable, which have to go elsewhere than to the shops and produce quite other than cash before they can get their supply? On the whole, what astonishing payments does cash make in this world? And so he's kind of like criticizing the Whig reforms that they give, because they make poor laws where people can work in workhouses and receive a meager wage there, or they can just give them subsidies to educational facilities, or they can just give the plebs money. And that's still how progressives today conduct public policy. It's just about dumping cash on people. But he gets to the crux of the issue, and kind of almost referring the capitalists and Adam Smith when he says supply and demand, and that there's other demands that cannot be satisfied by cash and go beyond that, and aren't that, and don't use the language of money. So I think that's just one of the many good points he makes. I mean, clearly the questions of their policies in which they give them more money or they subsidize these workhouses, the peasants, the working class, were still very dissatisfied and considered it. They wanted a loaf and they were given crumbs. So they were still quite dissatisfied with that, and that kind of fueled the Chartist movement, the movement for enfranchisement, almost even more. So you can see that even though they tried to think cash solved all problems, it really didn't. And you get the sense, even though I'm not really familiar with the historical period perfectly, you get the sense that they're hungering for something more than mere cash and political power.
Yeah. I don't know if I have much more to add on that topic in particular. But I suppose on the topic of laissez-faire more generally, which that Carlyle talks about that quite a bit throughout the whole book, and there's 2 chapters specifically on it. He says a lot of interesting things. In particular, he has one quote I'll read out. That the arrangement of good and ill success is this perplexed scramble of a world, which a blind goddess was always thought to preside over, are in fact the work of seeing goddesses or God, and require not only the and require only not to be meddled with. What stretch of I'm not good at reading this. Heroic faculty or inspiration of genius was needed to teach that. To button your pockets and stand still is no complex recipe. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer. So he's sort of parodying laissez-faire here. He's saying that like all you need to do is close your eyes and stand still, and the gods will just like reward you. It is like his parody of laissez-faire. And he talked about this more throughout the book. But I don't know reactions. What are your guys' thoughts on his thoughts on laissez-faire?
This is obviously the bit that I was most immediately not comfortable with, as I've been fully bathed in the water of libertarianism, and I consider it almost like a fundamental law of the universe that everyone should be left alone.
I got him. Violate that NAP.
Well, exactly. So probably at this point, I want to say something I need to think more about. So it's a topic that I feel I'm in flux on personally, so I don't want to pronounce on.
You know, a really good read, if you're interested in that journey, if you haven't already done it before, is Moldbug's 3-part essay on Thomas Carlyle, because he really does specifically discuss his journey as a former libertarian and how Carlyle kind of pulled him away from that after, somebody who was, deeply steeped in, Rothbard and Mises and all these guys. So.
In some ways, I think the libertarian answer is correct if you accepted that the only thing that mattered in life was line go up. If financial well-being, material well-being was the entirety of human life. If humans behaved like machines that just wanted profit, then the libertarian solution would be the beginning and the end. But the problem is that, as Carlyle lays out really well, actually, in this essay, there is way more to life than just what's his expression? He says, very frequently has my wallet been in the flaccid state, and when it's not, it's just it's just a tempt for pickpockets. Whereas he then talks really stirringly about the things that he has, that he considers his possession, that are not material, the breath of life that God gives him, and the ability to love, and things like this. His soul is the thing he wants to cling to. And when you see the world through less of a materialist and more a spiritual lens, some of the answers you come to about how society should be organized maybe change.
Yeah, and that's my problem is, if humans were computers, libertarianism would be the right software, right? But they're not. And so when you attempt to run them that way, it turns out as a disaster. And it's funny because in many ways, the most, especially in America, the most Christian people are the most libertarian. But many of them are libertarian because that's kind of where the political parties led them for a number of reasons, but also because they saw government encroaching aggressively against Christianity, right? And what they wanted was hands off. They basically gave up on the idea of Christendom. They gave up on the idea that there would be a Christian civilization and a Christian government, and basically just kind of took the rearguard action of saying, well, I guess as we're retreating, just leave us alone, right? And that was kind of what the Christian libertarianism became. But I think what we found in our own world, if we look around us, is that's kind of a disaster, right? And unfortunately, the ring of power is never destroyed. There is no Mount Doom for the ring of power for libertarians to throw power, to throw it into, and so instead it can only be wielded. and then you have to worry about who wields it and if they wield it for good. And so that's the thing. Again, if humans were only, if it was only about making the line go up, if the spiritual element and the spiritual well-being of humans wasn't the answer, then maybe I think libertarianism would work. But I think, like I said, Carlyle's argument there are pretty sound in many respects.
And just a PSA that even in the Lord of the Rings with the Mount Doom and getting rid of the Ring of Power, Tolkien is still such a based reactionary monarchist that he, has a king, saved the world at the very end. So I just want to reiterate that point. But I mean, I agree with everything that Auron was saying about that issue.
I'd like to read one quote which will completely redeem Carlyle's based status after all of my terrible attacks against him. I think I can recover him. He says, "For the idle man there is no place in this England of ours. He that will not work and save according to his means, let him go elsewhither. Let him know that for him the law has made no soft provision, but a hard and stern one, that by the law of nature, which the law of England would vaguely contend against in the long run, he is doomed either to quit these habits, or miserably to be extruded from the earth, which is made on principles different from these. He that will not work according to his faculty, let him perish according to his necessity."
Right. It's all utilitarian economics. And, I just want to say that this, we're not just completely debunking libertarianism as a way to explain the world, because it has some descriptive elements that are very appropriate, especially in a market economy and in a individualist society. It's just that there's this Milton Friedman school of thought that makes, freedom is very effective at, in free markets, people are very effectively producing more and creating wealth in society. So this must mean that freedom as an ideology, freedom qua freedom, is really the solution here. When really that's trying to derive, in the same way that you're trying to derive a moral from statistics, you're trying to derive a way of living just from the fact of analyzing a machine in an effective way. That's what the economy is. It's a grand machine that produces goods and services and all that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, again, Carlyle points this out, and we still struggle with it today. And Friedman has appeared to have won over the protectionists and the kinds of right-wing niches that were actually against capitalism, because at this point in time, capitalism is the left wing, and it's meant basically to. This is actually directly in the same time period as the protectionist versus free trade debate, where the free trade Whigs and others are appealing to Adam Smith and such, and so eventually they repeal the Corn Laws, which is basically like a protection on the farming and agriculture in England. And in fact, those Corn Laws was protecting and propping up the aristocracy. So liberalizing the economics was actually a left-wing thing that hurt and deconstructed the aristocracy, which was propped up by this agricultural protection. So that's a situation where the Whigs, as they're appealing to their new mass of enfranchised, rabble-rousing working class, they're kind of disempowering their political opponents in the old Tory aristocracy.
Yeah, that's one of the unfortunate things that the American discourse has done to understanding like political positions. Is basically we have classical liberals and we have progressive liberals, but they're all liberals, and most people don't understand that at this time there were choices other than the liberal project. And so when we say left and right, we mean things very different than what was meant at that time.
I guess the liberal project was pushing against the hegemony of Christianity to begin with, and then as soon as everything had pulled back culturally to be everyone's treated equally, they pushed ahead with the new religion. So in a weird way, the progressive position is now anti-liberal, because they don't want freedom of expression, they don't want freedom of opinion, because they've now cemented things in the way the direction that they wanted.
Yeah, and you can actually, I just started reading Bertrand de Juvenal, and he talks about this, how basically before we could have a political revolution, you needed a religious one, and it wasn't until the authority of the church was worn down you could actually then see the authority have to shift from a divine right to popular sovereignty. And once it moved to popular sovereignty, it was only a matter of time before rule moved from the monarch and the aristocracy to a parliamentary and then a more base democracy. And all of those things, of course, then also coincide with barriers going down economically as well. For all those things, he kind of traces those as one large movement. Yes.
Yeah, Lambda. I kind of want to bring to your awareness that Carlyle was kind of acknowledging this, where, yeah, I mean, now the paradigm is classical liberals versus progressive liberals, and then you were saying that in fact they are becoming more illiberal, and that's probably, first of all, because they just appeal to liberalism as kind of a tool to gain power for themselves when they're yeah, right, exactly, when they're on the outs, they want to infiltrate. And so they appeal to those principles, even though they have none. But Carlyle points out that this is, Cthulhu swimming left over time. That's how Moldbug actually describes it. But Carlyle is acknowledging that under a democracy, when it's ascendant and it becomes a system, when you have mass enfranchisement, you have a traditional society turn into a liberal society. And then the liberal society becomes a progressive society. And then the progressive society becomes, well, you might want to say communist or deracinated. It becomes a chaotic society that falls apart after some kind of communist dystopia, cyberpunk, whatever. But right now we're in the progressive evolving into the latter stage. That's where we are in history, when they were going from the traditional to the liberal stage.
It's all just the French Revolution.
Yeah.
I also blame the French.
Oh, you don't want to blame Luther?
Yeah, but there's one other quote on the laissez-faire topic that I wanted to read. New poor law, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. The master of horses, when the summer labor is done, has to feed his horses through the winter. If he said to his horse, "Quadrupeds, I no longer have work for you, but work exists abundantly over the world. You are ignorant. Or must I read to you political economy lectures that the steam engine always in the long run creates additional work?" That was just a quote that in particular stuck with me quite a bit. I think the point is kind of obvious, that it gets to a lot of the points that we've talked about already, and just that the sort of change in how economic the change in how economic relations are dealt with, the idea that that just like pulling back will just fix things.
Oh yeah, just laissez-faire. No, this is going to explode. Unfortunately.
But because I am, like, as much as I try and troll libertarians on Twitter, I am very sympathetic to libertarians in a certain sense. That Carlyle makes Carlyle talks about in here, where he says he says where is this one? To wise governors you will cry, see what you will and will not, and what you and will not let alone. To unwise governors you will cry, let alone all things, for heaven's sakes, meddle ye with nothing. And I think this is part of the reason for modern libertarianism, not the entire reason, but I think this is part of the reason for the reason why laissez-faire, why all these things can be attractive. It is not so much that libertarianism itself is good, but just that with how awful our current leaders are, with how awful our current governors are, Like I don't really want Jack Dorsey or Joe Biden to have more power. It's not that like I'm against government power in general. It's that I don't want these people to have the power. So there is a certain like tactical libertarianism that is that's more understandable, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about, kind of the Christian libertarianism we saw, kind of crop up in Americas. They kind of felt the hot breath of the state on their neck. And so their answer was, rather than trying to wrestle control of the state away from those who were going to probably start cracking down on them or trying to push them out of the public square, was to just say, fine, we'll leave, but leave us alone. And we want to reduce your power because it means you're less likely to come after us because you hate us and we don't want you to have that kind of power. And that I totally understand. And that was totally my my position for a long time. And this is something that I think people often get confused about when we'll talk about government powers. A lot of people say, well, statist, that's you're just going to hand power over to people who are going to crush you. And the answer is right now, yes, you're right. Like that's exactly what would happen. So I'm not arguing for increased power to awful people. But what I am saying is whenever those people are out of power, understand that unless good people are in power and have power, eventually bad people will come to power. There is no such thing as no power or, power so diffuse or so controlled that it will not bring those things to your doorstep. They always will. And so the only question is who's in charge of the power, who's in the driver's seat. I think that's the core problem with libertarianism, is not their impulse to not have to keep bad people from having control over their lives, but understanding that if someone powerful is not standing guard against these people, then they will always come for you in the end. That's my problem in the end.
Yeah, I think you have that correct. And I would acknowledge that is the problem with libertarianism. It doesn't have a model for power. It kind of explains, in a perfect world, if you had an infinite amount of power magically, and you could set up the world however you liked, what would be the best way to set it up? But it's a pretty useless theory in that sense, because that isn't the world that we inhabit. You have to get things done using force and diplomacy and politics. And therefore, the question is not what would the perfect world look like, but how do we go from our current state to a better state?
Well, do you see how sorry.
That's okay. I'll just say it real quick. And you'll see this in again, Schmidt, and you'll see it in you'll see it in a number of different political theorists. They'll say, like, look, basically the post-enlightenment thing was like, we just set up the right system. And if we set up the right system, then we don't have to trust people to do this job anymore, because we'll just craft the right system. And you will, if we get the right constitution, then we'll fiddle all the dials exactly right, and then we don't have to worry about it. But their argument, the argument for many of these people is, no, we always have to fight this battle. Like, there is no perfect system that just protects us from evil and too much power, that we can just set up the dials and walk away from the system. No, there always has to be someone in charge guarding these things at the end of the day. But sorry, 21st, I didn't mean to cut it on you.
No, I've been rather chatty this stream, although I think I brought us some good information. But I just want to say, Lambda, just to attack you right at the core of the libertarianism inside your, like, inside of your...
A libertarian intervention on me. Okay, carry on.
Right in the aorta of your libertarianism. The point you made, how it's a system of thought that is basically trying to obfuscate power completely. Do you see how that's a fundamentally atheistic ideology?
Right. In some ways, it's a mathematical, almost logical concept that it's like you're playing with numbers, and then people take that abstraction and assume that it's talking about the real world and try to apply it. And like you say, lots of things are missing from the theory, including God. But any kind of normative opinion is just completely blank. But the thing it will tell you is, it's like you can train an AI to improve if it's got a number to fixate on. The only number in the model of economics is the overall economic prosperity. So if people take an empty theory and try to apply it, they have to come up with a should, and that should will be line go up. I think that's the way those things have played out.
But I mean, like, yeah, I mean that's one part of it. It's kind of like it's supposed to be like a machine without a maker. It's kind of weird in that way. But if you think about power in the actual way that it is, as in you have control over other people and dominion over people and resources, essentially, that is not reduced to a formal government. That's an everyday reality of everything. So everyone exercises power in some way, unless they're female. But really though, everyone exercises power, and it's simply actually, if we want to get like de Maistre theological mode here, it is a reflection of God's power as we exercise power to farther his will in the temporal world. That's simply just a reflection of his power. And so if you deny that whole system, you're kind of denying the cause of it.
Actually, Carl Schmitt does this too. He says that the rise of liberal constitutions coincides with the rise of deism, because his theory is of course that the sovereign is the one who decides the exception. You know, once the system breaks down, someone has to decide when the system breaks down and when a leader has to act. And whoever is the person who decides when that exception to the system occurs, they're the person with the sovereignty. But he says that basically the reason that liberal constitutions come about is that it's just like deism is trying to remove miracles, divine intervention from the world. The liberal constitutionalists are trying to remove the sovereign, the exception, from the political world. They just want to pretend that the system will always solve every problem, that everything can be predicted and you can set things up exactly the right way and there'll always be an answer in the Constitution. But he says that's impossible. Systems always break down. At the point at which they do break down, someone is making a decision. That person's the sovereign. That person is acting in the mode of, like you're saying, the Heavenly Father when it comes to getting involved in the world. So,
in terms of how to get things done, I found this little paragraph extremely cathartic when I read it. It probably still applies. This is Carlyle talking about how absolutely useless the right-wing party is in the UK. Let the Tories be ministry if they will. Let at least some living reality be ministry. A rearing horse that will only run backward. He's not the horse that one would choose to travel on. Yet of all conceivable horses, the worst is the dead horse. Mounted on a rearing horse, you may back him, spur him, check him, make it a little way even backwards. But seated astride of your dead horse, what chance is there for you in the chapter of possibilities? You sit motionless, hopeless, as gods and among men. So that's I enjoyed reading that because it describes the uselessness of the right wing in politics, basically through all time.
I love it. It's it reminds me of like the opposite spectrum of like the liberal or libertarian, and then on the other side is the reactionary. It's like the libertarian saying the people at the top have too much power, and then the reactionary side is that the people at the top have too little power. Sovereignty has never been tried, so they're not actually accountable and in control in a way that can make them accountable. And then in this issue, Carlyle's like, the liberals and the Whigs are like, oh, we're too aristocratic and we do not care for the working class enough. And Carlyle is like, the old Tory aristocrats aren't aristocratic enough and they deracinated. And it's just,
Sorry, gentlemen, I didn't realize the time had gotten away from me. I have to head out, but thanks for having me. It's been a really interesting talk.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
See you.
I suppose quickly, I got one super chat no other gods than the sovereign economy, from Evola. And that's from Narco Republican for $2. Thanks, Narco Republican. So I mean, do we have much more to talk about? What's going on here?
There was one other thing that I wanted to kind of have a brief talk about, which was he said a couple of interesting things on the subject of the Roman Empire. So he says, the Romans, having conquered the world, held it conquered because they could best govern the world. The mass of men found it nowise pressing to revolt. Their fancy might be afflicted more or less, but in their solid interests, they were better than before. Very interesting take. So what he's saying, I think, is if you can maintain your empire for any length of time, that is in some sense consent from the people you're governing, because you wouldn't be able to keep control unless the people fundamentally thought that you were actually improving their well-being. Obviously, empire these days, not very popular, but according to Carlyle, actually bettering the lives, and I think you can see this historically, when a place gets taken over by a big power, it quite often does actually improve the lives of the people there. Although, on the other hand, there is obviously lots of oppression that happens as well. But Carlyle just generally accepting the way things happen in the world, I think a lot more than people tend to these days. He says, the Roman Empire happened, and it was probably for the best for most people. Quite an optimistic take in some ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's of course were the places colonized by the Roman Empire that ended up becoming the major world powers, eventually. But I mean, I think sort of part of his take there, what he's saying, is that what he's saying is that governments, in a certain sense, always rule by consent. In the sense that a government that's deeply unpopular can't last forever, and that if the Roman Empire ruled purely through conquest, it couldn't have lasted. It needed to actually provide.
Yeah, he talks later about why does the hyssop grow there in the chink of the wall? Because the whole universe, sufficiently occupied otherwise, could not hitherto prevent it growing. It has the might and the right. By the same law do Roman empires establish themselves. I think we'd be amiss to talk about Carlyle and not briefly touch on his interesting historiography. So he's saying causality there is just the fact that nobody stopped the hyssop plant and nobody stopped the Roman Empire. So that's really the beginning and the end of the story. The Romans, why did they take over the world? Because the universe didn't stop them.
And they did make things better, like both of you said. It kind of reminds me of the Monty Python skit from Life of Brian, the movie, where he's like, the Palestinian rebels, what is it called? Like the Palestinian People's Front or whatever. They're complaining like, and what did the Romans do for us? Oh, built roads? Oh, yes, other than the roads. Oh, schools? Other than school. Oh, peace in our times, all that stuff. Aqueducts. So it's this kind of thing we forget about these empires, is that usually they're just more competent, and literally it's market competition in some way, because they're just more competent and they're taking over an area, and because people are satisfied and they're more efficient and they're more productive, life moves on. So
if he's right about this, though, it brings us a challenge in that if in 50 years, 100 years, we are all under the thumb of constant lockdowns and progressivism has accelerated to 1 million miles an hour, and the status quo remains, according to Carlyle, that is generally most people accepting it as being better than the alternative, which is the perspective that I hear a great deal in our circles. But the kind of acceptance of, well, although we don't like what's happening, most people have decided that that's, realistically, no matter how powerful the digital and military weapons are, if all the people in the country were against what was going on, they could stop it.
Right. I mean, honestly, I was just kind of jumping on the bandwagon when it comes to popular consent and everything, and like the satisfaction of the public. In some sense, that's important, but it's not the only thing because I mean, this year has been a giant, whopping horse-sized red pill, the horse pills or whatever, in terms of looking at the average person and what they're willing to accept and what they actually are concerned about. It's pretty clear, well, not to compare them to cattle, but you know, they don't really have many higher interests, let's say, and they're willing to go into that bug box or whatever cyberpunk thing that we're gonna go towards. But I honestly don't think they can do this kind of stuff forever, and it actually won't be very popular eventually, especially even to the progressives who are sold all these dreams. And when those dreams don't come true, they'll be angry in some way. Usually that's pitted back against the people that oppose the dream. It's kind of that anger is redirected. But I don't think that trick is going to work forever. And so, I mean, honestly, this empire is probably not going to be here in 50 years. I mean, their financial system is literally awful, and they'll have a debt collapse. And so, one of my great dreams of the day is the debt collapse will finally come, and America will be liquidated, so to speak, and I'll buy America, and it'll be all mine.
Yeah, and that's another bit of Carlyle's optimism. He says, if there's this arrangement of things where ultimately these human beings are being treated like cattle, that they're not fulfilling this incredible human potential that they have, the system has all just men as its natural enemies. All just men will say this cannot last. Heaven disowns it. Earth is against it. Ireland would be burnt to a black unpeopled field of ashes rather than it should last. So Carlyle's view is like, if things get too bad, the whole system just falls apart and gets replaced by something better. And that is comforting because it puts a cap on how bad the totalitarian state can get, right? You can't end up in a ridiculous Orwellian nightmare dystopia, because before that happens, there will come a breaking point.
Right. Well, I do agree with you that all just men will oppose this as it rears its ugly head. But honestly, it kind of goes into the red pill that I was taking this year, when I'm thinking, yes, all just men will oppose this, all 5 of them. So yeah, we might be having trouble with that, but hopefully we'll have a few of the really good ones.
Yeah. So I don't know. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to talk about?
That's good.
There's just a nice little quote that kind of wraps it up in a way.
Okay, go ahead.
It's from the Laissez-faire chapter, and this is it. Imperfection, it is known, cleaves to human beings, to human things. Far is the ideal departed from in most times, very far. And yet so long as an ideal, any soul of truth does, in never so confused a manner, exist and work within the actual, it is a tolerable business. Not so when the ideal has entirely departed, and the actual owns to itself that it has no idea, no soul of truth any longer. At that degree of imperfection, human things cannot continue living. They are obliged to alter or expire. When they attain to that, blotches and diseases exist on the skin, and deeper, the heart continuing whole. But it is another matter when the heart itself becomes diseased, when there is no heart, but a monstrous gangrene pretending to exist there as heart. And so it's a repetition of what Dave the Distributor said in his common phrases, we can't keep living like this. And so I think that quote maps onto our situation quite well. And it's unsustainable, and in people's hearts, they won't accept it forever.
Yep, very true. I actually, looking through my notes, I have one more thing that I want to at least briefly touch on. And this is a point he makes close to the end about the quality of leaders at the time. And this is something I sort of briefly talk about a bit, but I'd like to just read one of the quotes he says. To teach religion, the first thing needful, and also the last and only thing, is to find a man who has religion. All else flows from this. Church building, church extensions, whatever else needful follows. Without this, nothing else will follow. And again, what this sort of gets at is the incredible poor quality of our leaders today. He's talking about churchmen specifically here, but he's more broadly talking about leaders in general. This is just one style of leader, and how there's like this technocratic desire to talk about like policies, like what's the new church policy that we can do to get people in the pews. But the real problem is that the quality of churchmen is so often very awful. And as I've said before, I have what I think is an unjustified reputation for being a sycophantic defender of the Catholic hierarchy and Pope Francis. I think I'm quite critical of them, just not in stupid ways, in intelligent ways. But I think this is the biggest problem with church leaders, both within the Catholic Church and in other churches, is that they're just like cowards. It's not like, yeah, there's many churches where they're like teaching heresy, like very bad heresies, like the Episcopalians and stuff, where they're like gay, but where like they're LGBT affirming, quote unquote. But like even within the Catholic Church, I think the biggest problem is that like most priests are just cowards. They're refusing to actually preach on hard subjects. They're refusing to actually talk about this stuff. And similarly, when I was an evangelical, I had like these same problems. It's not like I'm sure if I would have asked most of these pastors, they seemed like reasonably conservative. I'm sure they would have held the sort of traditional views on the controversial issues. That they just refused to ever talk about it. So yeah, that's sort of my diatribe on churchmen.
I'm glad that I'm not in a church that has a compulsory leader that I must follow, so I can happily disown somebody if they pronounce things that I disagree with.
That's why you're a libertarian.
Yeah, I'm a libertarian and a Baptist, and
Same thing.
I've more and more have been realizing that Baptists are just the libertarians of the church. So as my political views are changing, maybe I'll change denomination. I'll become C of E or something.
But yeah. So is that it, everyone?
TLDR, Carlyle was right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us. Give me money. Not optional. Subscribestar.com/settlerslament, patreon.com/settlerslament, and Teespring too. Doesn't matter how you give it. All that matters is that you give it. Goodbye, everyone.
Hold on. Can I do a couple of plugs? Is that okay?
Yeah. Sure.
First, thank you. Firstly, I have to plug the Bible study, which both of you fine gentlemen have been on in the past, and hopefully will do again. Maybe the best thing to find that is you go on in the description box, which has my channel's name, and then go to the About section, and then it's got a link to the Bible study from there. And I'm starting other channels as well. My latest video is on Chartism, as inspired by this video. So yeah, go and check those things out.
I have both of your channels in the description. And yeah, subscribe to 21sReaction's channel too, and Auron MacIntyre's also. Thank you everyone for joining us.